Hello everyone, welcome to a new video. Before we begin this incredible story, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any new content. Also, leave me a comment below telling me what you think about this story. Your support means so much to me. Now, let's dive into this fascinating narrative about intertwined destinies, power, and transformation. There was once an ordinary life, an existence marked by routine and predictability. In a small town where everyone knew each other and surprises were as scarce as stars on a cloudy night, lived a young woman whose existence flowed between the same cobblestone streets, the same repeated conversations, and the same postponed dreams. Every morning she woke to the sound of the neighborhood roosters, prepared breakfast with the same ingredients as always, and walked the familiar path to her modest job at the local bookstore. Her days blended into one another like watercolors on wet paper, each moment bleeding into the next without clear definition or remarkable distinction. The townspeople knew her as the quiet girl who always had her nose in a book, the one who smiled politely but never quite belonged to any particular social circle. Her life was safe, comfortable in its predictability, yet somewhere deep within her chest, there lived a restless longing for something more, something she couldn't quite name or understand. She had grown accustomed to the weight of unfulfilled potential, carrying it like an invisible burden that pressed against her shoulders with each passing year. Friends had moved away to bigger cities, chasing dreams and adventures, while she remained rooted in place. Held back by responsibilities and fears she barely acknowledged to herself. The mirror reflected back a face she recognized, but sometimes felt disconnected from, as if she were watching her own life from behind a thick pane of glass. Her small apartment above the bakery smelled perpetually of fresh bread and cinnamon, comforting scents that both soothed and suffocated her in equal measure. She had learned to find contentment in small pleasures, in the pages of fantasy novels that transported her to worlds where magic existed and destinies could be rewritten, where ordinary people discovered they were meant for extraordinary things. Yet each time she closed a book and returned to reality, the contrast felt sharper, the disappointment more acute, like waking from a beautiful dream into a gray morning. This was her world, her ordinary existence, and she had almost convinced herself it was enough. The bookstore where she worked was a cramped space filled with the musty scent of old paper and the quiet whispers of stories waiting to be discovered. Wooden shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed so tightly with volumes that they seemed to lean toward each other like old friends sharing secrets. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the single front window, creating an almost magical atmosphere that she cherished more than she cared to admit. The owner, an elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses and ink-stained fingers, rarely interfered with her work, preferring to spend his days in the back room, cataloging rare editions and muttering to himself about proper book preservation. She had free rein over the front of the store, arranging displays, recommending titles to the few customers who wandered in, and most importantly, stealing moments to read whenever business was slow. The regulars knew her by name and often sought her opinions on what to read next, trusting her intimate knowledge of every shelf and spine in the establishment. There was Mrs. Martinez, who came every Tuesday for romance novels, young Diego, who devoured science fiction like candy, and Professor Alvarado, who only read philosophy and often engaged her in long discussions about existentialism. These interactions, brief as they were, formed the highlights of her days, small connections that made her feel slightly less invisible in the grand scheme of things. The bookstore was her sanctuary, a place where she could hide from the expectations and judgments of the outside world, where her knowledge was valued and her presence mattered. Between the stacks of books, she had built a fortress of paper and ink, a protective barrier against a reality that often felt too sharp and unforgiving. The stories on those shelves were more real to her than most of her actual experiences, their characters more familiar than many people she knew in flesh and blood. She could recite passages from her favorite novels from memory, could lose herself so completely in fictional worlds that hours passed without her notice. This deep immersion in literature was both her greatest comfort and her most profound escape, a way to live 1,000 lives without ever leaving the safety of that small store. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet in familiar patterns, and she knew every squeaky board, every loose nail, every shadowy corner of that beloved space. On the day everything changed, the morning had begun like any other, with no hint of the transformation that awaited. She had opened the store at 9 o'clock sharp, flipping the faded sign from close to open and unlocking the heavy wooden door that always stuck slightly in its frame. The smell of coffee from the cafe next door wafted in on the cool breeze, mingling with the bookstore's characteristic scent of aging paper and leather bindings. She had arranged a new display of mystery novels in the front window, carefully positioning each book to catch the eye of passing pedestrians. Though few people wander down this particular street anymore since the new shopping center opened on the other side of town. The morning passed in its usual quiet rhythm, with only 2 customers stopping in, both browsing briefly before leaving empty-handed. By noon, she was deeply absorbed in a novel about ancient prophecies and hidden magic, her lunch forgotten on the counter beside her as she turned pages with increasing urgency, desperate to discover how the protagonist would escape the seemingly impossible situation the author had crafted. The protagonist reminded her of herself in some ways, an ordinary person thrust into extraordinary circumstances, forced to discover strengths they never knew they possessed. She was so engrossed in the story that she didn't hear the first knock at the door, didn't notice the way the air in the store seemed to shift and thicken, didn't see the shadow that fell across the threshold like a living thing. It was only the second knock, louder and more insistent, that finally pulled her attention away from the page and back to the present moment. She looked up, slightly annoyed at the interruption, expecting to see one of the usual customers or perhaps a delivery person with a box of new arrivals. Instead, standing in the doorway with the afternoon sun blazing behind him like a halo of fire, was a figure unlike anyone she had ever encountered before. He was tall, impossibly tall, with shoulders that seemed to fill the entire doorframe, and there was something about his presence that made the very air around him seem to vibrate with barely contained energy. His eyes, when they met hers across the length of the store, were the color of molten amber, ancient and knowing, holding depths that made her breath catch in her throat. In that single moment of connection, as their gazes locked and held, she felt something fundamental shift inside her, as if the universe itself had paused to take note of this meeting. The book slipped from her nerveless fingers, landing on the counter with a soft thump that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden, expectant silence. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, moving with a fluid grace that reminded her of predators she had only seen in nature documentaries, powerful and purposeful and utterly confident. His clothing was expensive. She could tell that much even with her limited knowledge of fashion, tailored perfectly to his impressive frame in shades of charcoal and midnight blue that somehow seemed to absorb the light around him. There was an air of command about him, an unspoken authority that made her want to stand straighter, to smooth down her simple dress and fix her perpetually messy hair. He surveyed the bookstore with those remarkable eyes, taking in every detail with an intensity that made her feel as if he were seeing not just the physical space, but something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface of ordinary reality. When his gaze returned to her, she felt pinned in place like a butterfly under glass, unable to move or look away, barely able to breathe under the weight of his attention. He smiled then, a slow curve of lips that held both danger and promise, and spoke her name in a voice that resonated in her chest like the low note of a cello. She hadn't told him her name, hadn't introduced herself, yet he said it with such certainty, such familiarity, as if he had known her for years rather than seconds. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, cataloging the strangeness of the moment even as some deeper part of her, some instinct she didn't know she possessed, recognized him in return. It was impossible, ridiculous, the stuff of the fantasy novels she loved, yet here he stood in her ordinary bookstore, making the impossible feel suddenly, terrifyingly real. He moved closer, each step measured and deliberate, and she found herself backing up until she hit the counter behind her, trapped between wood and this overwhelming presence. He stopped just close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the faint pattern of gold threading through the amber of his eyes, could smell something wild and clean like forest after rain. When he spoke again, his words were simple, but they crashed through her carefully constructed life like a wrecking ball through paper walls. He told her that he had been searching for her, that she was not who she thought she was, that her ordinary life was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion designed to keep her safe until this very moment. The world as she knew it was about to end, and her true existence, her real destiny, was finally ready to begin. Her first reaction was disbelief, irrational rejection of everything he was saying, because accepting it would mean accepting that everything she knew was a lie. She laughed, a nervous sound that echoed too loudly in the quiet store, and told him he must have the wrong person, that she was nobody special. Just a girl who worked in a bookstore and lived an unremarkable life. But even as the words left her mouth, she felt their falseness, felt the way they rang hollow against some truth she had always sensed but never acknowledged. He didn't argue with her, didn't try to convince her with words. Instead, he simply reached out and touched her wrist with one finger, and the world exploded into color and sensation. It was as if she had been living her entire life in black and white, and suddenly, in that single touch, everything burst into vibrant technicolor. She could feel energy coursing through her veins like liquid lightning, could sense connections and patterns in the world around her that she had never perceived before, could hear whispers of voices speaking in languages she shouldn't understand but somehow did. The bookstore around her seemed to shimmer and shift, the familiar shelves and books taking on new dimensions, new meanings, as if they had always been more than they appeared, but she had lacked the eyes to see it. He released her wrist and the intensity faded slightly, but it didn't disappear completely, instead settling into her awareness like a new sense she would never be able to ignore again. She staggered, gripping the counter for support, her legs suddenly unreliable beneath her as her mind struggled to process what had just happened. He watched her with those ancient eyes, patient and knowing, waiting for her to reach the inevitable conclusion. When she finally looked up at him again, when she finally whispered the question that changed everything, asking who she really was, he smiled again. And this time, there was something like pride in the expression. He told her she was the last of a bloodline that everyone believed had ended decades ago, that she carried within her the power to reshape the balance between worlds, that forces both light and dark had been searching for her since the moment of her birth. Her parents, the people she thought were her parents, had been guardians assigned to hide her, to keep her safe and ignorant until she was strong enough to face her true heritage. That time had come, whether she felt ready or not, because the barriers between worlds were weakening and only she possessed the specific combination of abilities needed to restore them. He was an Alpha Lord, a leader of one of the ancient families that protected the boundaries between the human world and the realm of magic and power that existed alongside it. He had sworn an oath to find her, to train her, to prepare her for the challenges ahead. And he could not fail in that mission. The hours that followed passed in a blur of revelations and impossibilities that she struggled to absorb. He told her stories that sounded like fairy tales but were presented as historical fact, tales of ancient conflicts between powerful families, of magic that flowed through certain bloodlines like an inheritance, of a world hidden just beneath the surface of ordinary reality, where every myth and legend held seeds of truth. She was descended from the Moonkeepers, he explained, a lineage of women who had once maintained the balance between lunar magic and the mortal realm, who could harness the power of moonlight itself and use it to heal, to protect, to create barriers that nothing dark could cross. Her grandmother had been the last known Moonkeeper, a woman of immense power who had sacrificed herself to seal a rift between worlds, buying humanity decades of peace, but leaving the bloodline apparently extinct. Except it wasn't extinct because her mother had survived, had hidden herself away, and eventually had a daughter, had passed on the gift even while living in denial of it. That daughter was her, though she had grown up completely unaware of her heritage, protected by spells and charms that dampened her abilities and kept her hidden from those who would seek to use or destroy her. But those protections were fading now, worn thin by time and her approaching maturity into full power, and the signs of her existence were beginning to bleed through into the awareness of beings who had long searched for any remnant of the Moonkeeper line. Some of those beings meant her well, wanted to help her reclaim her heritage and use her gifts for good. Others, however, saw her as a threat to their plans, an obstacle to be eliminated before she could become strong enough to oppose them. The Alpha Lord had reached her first, but others were coming, and she needed to decide quickly whether she would run and hide as her mother had done, or stand and fight for a destiny she never asked for but could no longer escape. He made it clear that the choice was hers, that he would not force her down any particular path, but also that choosing to ignore her heritage would not make it go away, would not protect her from those who were already hunting. The mark was on her, invisible to ordinary eyes, but blazing like a beacon to those with the sight to perceive it. And denying her nature would only leave her vulnerable and untrained when the inevitable confrontation came. She could hear the truth in his words, could feel it resonating with something deep inside her that had always known she was different, had always sensed there was more to existence than what met the eye. Still, accepting it meant leaving behind everything she knew, everyone she loved, stepping into a world of danger and uncertainty with only this stranger as her guide. As night fell and the bookstore grew dark around them, she found herself telling him things she had never told anyone, confessing to the dreams that had haunted her since childhood, dreams of running through moonlit forests with silver light streaming from her fingertips, dreams of standing atop mountains and calling down the stars, dreams of battles fought and won against shadows that sought to devour the light. She had always dismissed these dreams as products of an overactive imagination, the result of reading too many fantasy novels and wanting her own life to be more interesting than it was. But now, hearing herself describe them aloud to someone who nodded knowingly at each detail, she began to understand they had never been mere dreams at all, but memories of another life. Visions of her true self trying to break through the barriers that had been erected to protect her. He asked her questions that forced her to examine her past with new eyes, to see the patterns she had missed, the moments when her carefully constructed ordinary life had shown cracks and she had simply looked away rather than investigate. The time she had been in a car accident that should have killed her but walked away without a scratch. The moment she had wished desperately for rain during a drought and storm clouds had materialized within minutes. The instant she had known with absolute certainty that her best friend was in danger, even though they were miles apart, and she had no rational reason to worry. These weren't coincidences or lucky breaks, he told her. They were manifestations of her suppressed power, moments when her true nature broke through despite all the barriers meant to contain it. She had been living a half-life, existing in a shadow of what she was meant to be, and somewhere deep down she had always felt that disconnect, that sense that she was watching her own life from outside rather than truly living it. The restlessness that had plagued her, the feeling of waiting for something without knowing what, the attraction to stories of magic and transformation, all of it made sense now in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She looked at her hands in the darkness, these ordinary hands that had shelved books and poured coffee and done 1,000 mundane tasks, and tried to imagine them wielding power, channeling moonlight, reshaping reality itself. It seemed impossible, yet the more she sat with the idea, the more right it felt, as if a puzzle piece she hadn't known was missing had suddenly clicked into place. The Alpha Lord watched her process all of this with infinite patience, answering her questions when she asked them, remaining silent when she needed space to think, a steadying presence in the chaos of revelation. By the time the moon rose high and bright outside the bookstore windows, she had made her decision, though it felt less like a choice and more like an acceptance of inevitable truth. She couldn't go back to pretending, couldn't unknow what she now knew, couldn't unsee the larger world that had been revealed to her. If she truly was the last moonkeeper, if she genuinely carried this power and responsibility in her blood, then running from it would be a betrayal not just of her heritage, but of everyone who might suffer if she refused to step into her role. The thought terrified her, the sudden weight of expectation and duty, but it also ignited something within her that had been dormant too long, a fierce determination she hadn't known she possessed. She stood, squaring her shoulders and meeting the Alpha Lord's gaze with newfound resolve, and told him she would go with him, would learn what she needed to learn, would become what she was meant to be. She saw approval flash in those amber eyes, saw something that might have been relief, and realized he had been more uncertain of her answer than he had let on, that her choice mattered more than he had initially suggested. He rose as well, and in a gesture that felt both formal and deeply personal, he placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head to her, acknowledging her not as the uncertain bookstore clerk she had been that morning, but as the moonkeeper she was becoming. The gesture moved her more than she expected, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes as the full weight of what was happening finally settled in her chest. This was real. All of it was real, and her life would never be the same. She thought of the small apartment above the bakery, the few possessions that made up her material existence, the simple routine that had defined her days. All of it suddenly seemed like props in a play, temporary things she had been borrowing rather than truly owning. Her real life, her true self, had been waiting all along for this moment, for this stranger to knock on her door and call her home to a destiny she never knew she had. The Alpha Lord extended his hand to her, not demanding or commanding, but offering an invitation to step across the threshold from one world into another. She looked at that hand for a long moment, strong and steady and utterly certain, and then she reached out and took it. The training began that very night, no time wasted in transition or preparation, throwing her immediately into a reality far stranger than any book she had ever read. The Alpha Lord took her from the bookstore to a place that existed in the spaces between, a realm that was neither fully the human world nor completely the magical one, but something in between, a threshold space where those like them could gather and work without fear of discovery. It appeared to be an enormous mansion, all stone walls and ancient tapestries, filled with others like him, people who moved with that same predatory grace and carried that same sense of otherworldly power. They looked at her with curiosity and some with suspicion, this untrained girl who claimed to be the last moonkeeper, this potential they weren't sure would prove real or simply collapse under the weight of expectation. The Alpha Lord introduced her to his council, a group of powerful individuals who led their people and protected the boundaries between worlds, each of them possessing abilities and strengths that made her head spin. There was a woman who could manipulate fire with a thought, a man who spoke to storms and commanded the wind, a warrior whose speed made him little more than a blur when he chose to move. They were legends, all of them, and she was supposed to stand among them as an equal, supposed to develop her own power until she could match their strength. The doubt must have shown on her face because the Alpha Lord pulled her aside and reminded her that she was not starting from nothing, that the power was already within her, dormant and waiting, and all she needed to do was learn to access it, to shape it, to trust it. He would be her primary teacher, he told her, because his gift was transformation, the ability to change not just himself, but to help others change as well, to guide them through the process of becoming something more than they had been. Over the weeks and months that followed, he pushed her harder than she had ever been pushed, demanding more of her than she thought possible, refusing to accept her limitations or her excuses. He taught her to meditate under the full moon, to open herself to its light and feel it flowing into her, filling places inside her that had been empty all her life. He taught her to channel that light through her body and out through her hands, to shape it into shields and weapons, into tools of healing and protection. He made her practice until her muscles screamed and her mind felt like it would crack from the strain, then pushed her to go further still, insisting that her limits were illusions she had accepted without question. The others in the mansion watched her progress with varying degrees of interest and skepticism, some offering encouragement, others clearly waiting for her to fail and prove their doubts justified. She learned quickly who among them were allies and who would remain distant until she proved herself worthy of their respect. There was Kara, the fire wielder, who took her under her wing and taught her practical lessons about surviving in a world of politics and power, about reading people and protecting herself from those who would manipulate or use her. There was Marcus, the storm speaker, who challenged her constantly, but in ways that made her stronger, pushing her to defend her ideas and stand firm in her convictions rather than simply following orders. And there was Elena, a healer whose gentle demeanor hid a core of absolute steel, who taught her that power without compassion was nothing but destruction, that true strength came from knowing when to fight and when to heal. These people became her new family, her community in a world where she had once felt utterly alone. Yet through all of it, through all the new relationships and lessons and challenges, it was the Alpha Lord who remained her constant, her anchor in the chaos of transformation. He was demanding but never cruel, pushing her past her limits while somehow knowing exactly how far he could push before she would break. He celebrated her victories, no matter how small, and refused to let her wallow in her failures, insisting she learn from them and move forward. Gradually, over time measured in moons rather than days, she began to change, to grow into the power that had always been hers, but that she had never known how to access. The uncertain bookstore clerk faded away, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, more complete. She could feel the magic now as naturally as she felt her own heartbeat, could call it forth with barely a thought, could shape moonlight into tangible form and wield it with increasing precision and strength. The dreams that had once confused her now made perfect sense, memories of ancestral knowledge passed down through her bloodline, experiences of moonkeepers who had come before her flowing into her awareness and teaching her things no living person could explain. She was becoming what she was always meant to be, and in that becoming, she found a sense of purpose and belonging she had never experienced in her ordinary life. But power, as she learned, always came with a price, and the stronger she grew, the more attention she attracted from forces that wished her harm. The first attack came on a night when the moon was dark, when her powers were at their weakest, and she was most vulnerable. Shadows materialized in the mansion's courtyard, things that had no solid form but dripped with malevolence and hunger, sent by enemies who had finally pinpointed her location and were testing her defenses. The Alpha Lord and the others fought alongside her, teaching her in the midst of battle how to stand against darkness even when the moon offered no light, how to find the power within herself rather than relying solely on external sources. She discovered that night that her gift was not just about channeling moonlight, but about embodying its essence, becoming a light in the darkness that nothing could extinguish. When dawn finally broke and the shadows fled, she stood in the courtyard covered in sweat and shaking with exhaustion, but also with triumph, because she had survived, had fought, had proven to herself and to the others that she was not just a legacy or a bloodline, but a warrior in her own right. The Alpha Lord found her sitting on the fountain's edge, watching the sunrise, and for the first time since they had met, she saw something in his eyes that looked like vulnerability. He told her then that he had lost someone once, another moonkeeper he had failed to protect, and that finding her, training her, keeping her safe had become more than just a duty, but a chance at redemption. She reached out and took his hand, understanding in that moment that their connection had grown beyond teacher and student, beyond protector and protected, into something deeper and more complex. They were bound together now by shared purpose and growing affection, two people from different worlds who had found in each other something they hadn't known they were searching for. He warned her that the attacks would continue, would intensify as she grew stronger, that those who wanted the barriers between worlds to fall saw her as their greatest obstacle. But he also promised that she would not face those challenges alone, that he and all the others would stand with her, fight beside her, and if necessary die to protect her right to fulfill her destiny. The months turned into a year, and with each passing season she grew more skilled, more confident, more fully herself. She learned to fight with weapons both magical and mundane, to read the signs and portents in the moon's phases, to sense disturbances in the barriers between worlds and respond before they became crises. She became the moonkeeper in truth, not just in name or blood, but in action and purpose. The council that had once regarded her with skepticism now looked to her for guidance, trusting her instincts and her judgment because she had proven herself worthy of that trust time and time again. She had faced down shadow creatures and rogue mages, had sealed rifts and healed wounds in the fabric between worlds, had made impossible choices and lived with their consequences. Yet even as she grew into her power and her role, she never forgot the ordinary girl she had been, the one who had shelved books and dreamed of adventures from the safety of familiar routine. That girl was still part of her, still lived in her heart, and she carried those memories not as a burden, but as a reminder of where she had come from, of the normal life she was fighting to protect for others. The bookstore still existed in her mind as clearly as if she visited it every day, that small space filled with stories and possibilities, the place where her journey had truly begun. She wondered sometimes about the owner, about the regular customers, about whether they had noticed when she disappeared, or if her absence had been covered by some spell that made them forget she had ever existed. The Alpha Lord assured her that memories had been adjusted, that those people were safe and living their ordinary lives without the burden of knowing what she had become. It should have brought her comfort that sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, she felt a pang of loss for that simplicity, for the ability to live without knowing about the darkness that pressed against the edges of the world, hungry to break through and consume everything in its path. The final confrontation came, as these things always do, when she least expected it, but was somehow most prepared. The barriers between worlds had been weakening for months despite her best efforts. The damage too extensive and too old to heal quickly or easily. Someone or something on the other side had been working systematically to tear them down, to create an opening large enough for invasion. The council had tracked the source to an ancient site, a place where the barriers had first been established millennia ago, where the fabric between worlds was thinnest and most vulnerable. They gathered their forces and prepared for war, knowing that this battle would determine the fate of both realms. That failure was not an option because there would be no second chances. The Alpha Lord tried to convince her to stay behind, to let the others handle the fighting while she remained safe, but she refused with a fierce determination that surprised even herself. This was her purpose, her destiny, the reason she had been born and hidden and trained. She was the Moonkeeper, the last of her line, and if she would not stand at the front of this battle, then what had all the sacrifice and struggle been for? He yielded to her arguments, though she could see the fear in his eyes, the terror of losing her after everything they had been through together, everything they had come to mean to each other. She kissed him then, there in the great hall surrounded by warriors and mages preparing for battle, kissed him with all the passion and promise of a life she hoped they would have the chance to live together when this was over. He held her like she was precious and breakable, even though they both knew she was neither, and whispered words in an ancient language that she understood meant protection and love and forever. Then they armored themselves in magic and will, gathered their allies around them, and marched through a portal toward the ancient site where their enemies waited. The battle that followed was everything the old stories promised and nothing she could have imagined. Reality itself seemed to bend and tear as forces collided, as magic clashed with magic and the barriers between worlds screamed in protest. She saw wonders and horrors, fought alongside legends and against nightmares, pushed herself beyond every limit she thought she had, and discovered new reservoirs of strength she hadn't known existed. The Alpha Lord fought at her side, his transformation magic allowing him to become whatever was needed most in each moment. Shield or sword, healer or destroyer, adapting and protecting and devastating in equal measure. She lost track of time in the chaos, knew only the rhythm of breath and power, the flow of moonlight through her veins, the burning determination to not let this darkness win. When the enemy's leader finally revealed themselves, stepping through a tear in reality with power radiating from them like corrupted starlight, she understood with sudden clarity that this being had once been like her, a keeper of balance who had been seduced by the promise of greater power, who had chosen to tear down rather than preserve. The tragedy of it struck her even as they faced each other across the battlefield, two sides of the same coin, two possibilities of what a moonkeeper could become. They fought with everything they had, magic against magic, will against will, and the world itself seemed to hold its breath watching. She felt herself weakening, felt her power draining faster than she could replenish it, saw the moment when her opponent realized victory was within reach. Then the Alpha Lord was there, stepping between them, taking a blow meant for her, falling as she screamed his name. The rage and grief that tore through her in that moment was more powerful than any magic she had been taught, a primal force that erupted from her core and blazed like a second sun. She channeled everything she was, everything she had been, everything she might have been in that ordinary life she had left behind, poured it all into one final surge of power that shattered her enemy and sealed the barriers between worlds so completely that nothing would threaten them again for generations. When the light faded and she could see again, she found herself kneeling in scorched earth, the Alpha Lord cradled in her arms, his life force flickering like a candle in wind. She poured healing into him desperately, called on every lesson Elena had taught her, begged the moon above to save him because she could not bear to lose him, not now, not when they had finally won. The others gathered around, adding their power to hers, and slowly and possibly, he opened his eyes and smiled at her. That dangerous smile that had first unsettled her in the bookstore doorway, that had changed her life. He told her she had done it, had saved both worlds, had become not just a moonkeeper, but the moonkeeper, the one stories would be told about for centuries. She laughed and cried at the same time, held him close and felt his heartbeat steady and strong against her chest, and knew that they had been given something precious, a second chance, a future they had earned through blood and sacrifice and unwavering determination. The council declared the battle won, the threat ended, and slowly they all returned to the mansion that had become her home, carrying their wounded and mourning their dad, but also celebrating their victory. The world was safe, the barriers restored, and she had fulfilled the destiny she never asked for, but had grown to embrace with her whole heart. In the weeks that followed, as they healed and rebuilt and learned to live without the constant pressure of imminent danger, she found herself thinking often about that day in the bookstore when her ordinary life had ended. She had been so afraid then, so uncertain, convinced she was nothing special and would surely fail at whatever impossible task was being asked of her. But she had not failed, had not broken, had instead discovered strength and purpose she never could have found in that safe, predictable existence. The Alpha Lord, recovering steadily from wounds that would have killed anyone with less determination, watched her with those amber eyes that saw too much and understood even more. He asked her one evening as they sat together under the moon if she regretted it, regretted the choice to leave her ordinary life behind, to embrace danger and duty and all the pain that came with it. She thought about the question carefully, honored it with genuine consideration rather than a quick answer. There were things she missed about that simpler life, she admitted, the peace of it, the safety, the ability to lose herself in stories without worrying that the monsters between the pages might actually exist. But she would not trade who she had become for who she had been, would not give up the knowledge and power and purpose she had found, would not wish away the people she had met and the bonds she had forged. Most of all, she would not wish away him, this impossible man who had knocked on her door and changed her fate, who had seen potential in her when she saw only inadequacy, who had pushed and challenged and believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself. He took her hand then, laced his fingers through hers, and told her what he had been too afraid to say during the battle, too superstitious to speak aloud when the outcome was uncertain. He loved her, had loved her from the moment he first saw her in that bookstore, though he had tried to deny it, had tried to keep things professional and distant because caring made losing unbearable. But they had survived, had won, and he was done pretending that she was just a duty or a responsibility when she was so much more. She smiled then, really smiled, and told him she loved him too, that somewhere between being terrified of him and fighting beside him, she had fallen completely and irrevocably in love. They kissed under the moonlight that was both her power and her legacy, two souls who had found each other against impossible odds and who would face whatever came next together. The story could end there, with victory won and love declared, with the heroine fully transformed into her destined role and the world saved from darkness. But life, even magical life, does not truly end with any single triumph or moment of achievement. Instead, it continues, flowing forward like a river, carrying both calm waters and unexpected rapids. She remained the moonkeeper, guardian of the barriers, protector of balance between worlds, and that role continued to demand her attention and her power. But she learned to balance duty with joy,